So finally, we're going to hear Clayton speak to us today. If anyone knows Clayton, he's a great guy, and I'm just going to read the bio or parts of the bio for you. He actually started SM, was it 2016? Yep. Came from the University of Montana, where he had his master's degree. And his research interests include classic depositional systems, sequence stratigraphy, diagenesis, reservoir characterization, the interplay between tectonics and sedimentation, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It just goes on and on. He's done a lot of different things. And he's currently on the reservoir characterization team at SM Energy in the Midland Basin. He's also an associate editor of the Mountain Geologist, a co-coordinator of the Rocky Mountain section IBA, and a treasurer-elect of the Rocky Mountain section of AAPG. And like I said, he got his master's from the University of Montana and his bachelor's from the University of Idaho. So we're excited to hear from him. And last night, I unfortunately missed the State of the Union with President Biden. I was playing dodgeball with youth from our church. But when President Biden spoke on oil, the price of oil changed $5 from one single talk. That's pretty significant. Now, you might have different opinions if you want the price going up or down, but one single talk about oil caused the price of oil to change by that much. So you have a challenge. Let's see what you can do in the next 45 minutes. We're going to turn time over to Clayton. We're gonna save the questions to the end.
Paul. Yeah, so thanks for the introduction, Mark, and I'll do my best to have an influence on oil prices today. So as Mark alluded to, my talk today will be on the controls of diagenesis, the Sappington Formation in the Bridger Range in southwestern Montana, understanding the significance of facies, stratigraphic architecture, and faults on cement distribution. And this computer is not going to stay. Okay, hopefully this will stay in somewhat. Okay. So today we'll start with a brief introduction, go through the geologic setting and the study area, walk through the stratigraphic framework of the Sappington, and get to the real results of this work, being the cement types and then the distribution of those cements. I'll walk through a conceptual model for the controls and mineralization, and then wrap up with some implications and conclusions. So to start, I just want to introduce a very kind of a basic topic here, and that is make sure we're all on the same page. And this is looking at it in a very binary sense and probably over simplistic, but the idea between open and closed diagenetic systems. So on one hand, we have an open diagenetic system where ions can be transported away from the site of dissolution and then exported out of the system, whatever scale you want that to be. On the other hand, we have a closed diagenetic system where the ions are not transported away from the site of dissolution, and they must be accounted for in the precipitation of another phase. So if we look at the open diagenetic system first, so if we have a grain of feldspar in the presence of some acid, it can be dissolved into some ions, which can then go into aqueous solution and be transported away from that site of dissolution. But in the closed system, you can dissolve the same grain of feldspar, but it can't escape the site of dissolution. It must be precipitated as another phase, another more stable phase, so say clay and quartz. So just a concept to keep in mind that I'll come back to at the end of the talk. So moving on now to the Sappington Formation. It's been studied for well over 100 years, beginning in the 1800s with the USGS, who looked at the general stratigraphy and made some general geologic maps of southwestern Montana. Up here's a beautiful field sketch by Peel from 1896, which I certainly couldn't do today. And then there's a resurgence in the 60s and 70s in the Sappington with a focus on the biostratigraphy and the generalized depositional environments. And then more recently, about a decade ago, the emergence of the Bakken, using the Sappington as an outcrop analog for the Bakken, with a focus on sequence stratigraphy, depositional systems, and stratigraphic architectures. And so this is some work by Anna, who is a good friend and colleague of mine and works hand in hand with this project. So the Sappington straddles the Devonian to Mississippian boundary. It's highlighted here in yellow on this track column. And it represents a relatively thin plastic succession and an overall thicker succession of carbonates in southwestern Montana. And it was deposited during the emergence of the antler orogeny on the western side of Laurentia during the Devonian system. So looking at the paleogeography during this period of time in Montana, we have the Sappington Basin occupying the center part of the state here, and separated from the Exshaw and Williston Basins to the north and to the east, respectively, by the central Montana uplifts that occupied the center part of the state. And then down to the south, we have the Cottonwood Canyon Basin, separated by the Beartooth Shelf from the Sappington Basin. And so this work was really focused on the Bridger Range here in the red box on the southwestern side of the Sappington Basin. So the Bridger Range is a pretty interesting geologic history. It's a north-south trending uplift just outside of the town of Bozeman. And as I mentioned, has a really complex structural history. So on the western side of the range, is bounded by a series of basin and age range normal faults. There are also some really great examples of both severe and laramide style deformation on the eastern side. However, the severe style is really limited to the northern side of the range, and laramide style dominates on the southern side of the range. So to kind of show you, give you some more context about that, what that looks like, here's a couple of cross sections, one from the north here at A prime, and then the south one being B prime, showing the severe style deformation pretty well here in like with this cross range fault, which cuts across the northern side of the range here in the subsurface, and also at the outcrop or on the surface here, not labeled. But then that is subsequently cross-cut by laramide style deformation involving the basement, which should be off the cross section to the left. And then comparing that to what we see on the southern side of the range being dominated by laramide style deformation, with not really much evidence of that thinner skinned severe style deformation. And that's controlled by the presence of a east-west lineament that runs across the center portion of the range here, called the called the Pass Fault. And this has been active since at least the Proterozoic, where it served as the southern margin of the belt basin. And on the northern side of that fault, there's over 1.5 kilometers of conglomerates associated with the LaHood group of the belt group. On the southern side, there is no belt rock, and there's just Archean basement. So you can see that represented in the cross sections by this brown being the LaHood group, and then the Archean here being the Archean rocks. And so even though there's all these structural features, really the only one that has an influence on diagenesis is that deep-seated lineament that I just mentioned, the Pass Fault. So we'll come back to that later. So focusing back in on the Sappington, these red stars represent the outcrops in which we have focused the study on. I'm not going to name them all by name here, but I will be talking a lot about the North Cottonwood outcrop to the north and the Saddle Peak outcrop down here to the south. Depositionally, the southern side of the range represents more proximal outcrops, and the northern side of the range represents more distal outcrops. So the last piece of information before moving on is going through the burial history of the Sappington, which is shown over here on the right. And so for those of you who are not used to looking at these types of figures, this is simply just looking at the depth below the sea level of each particular stratigraphic formation highlighted by these, or shown by these black lines. And then the colors you're looking at are just the temperature and the subsurface through time, with the light colors being, the warm colors being high temperatures and the cool colors being low temperatures. And then this red line is the Sappington. So it underwent a relatively rapid burial during the Mississippian, went through a long period of tectonic quiescence from the Mississippian through the Jurassic, and underwent rapid burial with the orogenic fronts that came through in the Jurassic. And then eventually was uplifted to the outcrop that we see. In all, it reached a burial depth of about 2.5 kilometers and temperatures of about 130 degrees Celsius. So moving on now to the stratigraphic framework in the Sappington. So starting off on the left-hand side of the screen here, as I mentioned previously, it straddles the Devonian to Mississippian boundary, but in more detail, the Sappington has been divided into 3 members, the lower, the middle, and the upper. And the lower and the middle members have been assigned Devonian age or Fomenian would be the stage. And then the upper member is Mississippian in age or Tarasnian for the stage. And of significance here is there's about a 2.5 million year gap between the end of deposition of the middle member and beginning of deposition of the upper member, which again has some influence of diagenesis that we'll come back to later on in the presentation. Looking at how that breaks out with the stratigraphically over here further to the right, the lower member is called the lower shale. The middle member is subdivided into the lower siltstone, a middle shale, and the upper siltstone. And then lastly, the upper member is just referred to simply as the upper shale. Taking that one step further and translating that to sequence stratigraphy, the Sappington represents deposition during 2 complete depositional sequences and a 3rd partial sequence. So the base of the Sappington represents a sequence boundary, which grades upward to a maximum floating surface in the middle of the lower shale, and then grades up to a high stand at the top of the lower siltstone, which marks a 2nd sequence boundary, followed by a 2nd maximum floating surface in the middle shale. A short high stand is truncated by a basal surface of forced regression, which results in rapid perturbation of the Sappington basinward, and of course, initiation of the following stage of track, which continues to a 3rd sequence boundary at the top of the upper member, upper siltstone, the 3rd maximum floating surface, and then into a high stand, which continues into the overlying lodgement. So to give you an idea of what this stuff looks like in outcrop, here are a couple of photo pans from one of the outcrop locations in the Bridger Range. The top is the photos are the same, the bottom has some interpretation on it. And this is just showing the outcrop style of both the lower, the middle, and the upper members, and then of course the overlying. The point here is to just give you an idea of how well outcrop this is. Taking this to one step further, looking at how some of the facies vary across the range. This is another figure for Fermana, running from south on the right to north on the left, which is again more proximal to more distal. And the colors we're looking at are differences in facies associations. So the dark gray here are offshore facies, purple are carbonate buildup facies, green are offshore transition, yellow are middle shore face, and lastly, the orange are upper shore face. So there's a lot going on here. I'm not going to walk through all the details that are present, but there are a couple of things I want to highlight as they have implications for the things we'll be talking about later. The first is that from south to north, there's a drastic thickening in the upper and in the lower shale, going from less than 1 meter in the proximal locations to more than 3 meters to the north in the more distal locations. And as that thickening occurs, there's also a drastic increase in TOC from less than 1% on average in the south to about 10% on average in the north, reaching upwards of like 15% in some of the states. Similarly, looking at the middle shale here, that also has some interesting proximal distal changes. So to the south, it's a little bit more, has a little bit less clay, and becomes progressively more clay rich as you move basinward. And above that maximum flooding surface, we see middle shore face deposits to the south, and then we grade out to, into offshore transition deposits in the next, above that basal surface to force regression that I mentioned earlier, we see these downlapping phynoforms that present themselves pretty nicely in outcrop, and those have some implications for fluid flow that again we'll come back to later. And lastly, the presence of that past fault that I mentioned earlier manifests itself in the stratigraphy with the thickening of the upper shale in this Potter's Gulch outcrop relative to the on the downthrown side of that fault relative to the Ross Peak outcrop, which is on the upthrown side. So again, that's speaking that to be a long lived lineament that's been active throughout the deposition history. Okay, so with that view, the facies in mind, let's move on to talk about the grains in which all of these diagenetic faces still the framework. The two dominant framework grains that we observe in the Sappington are quartz and feldspar. Generally, we're looking at silt-sized grains, but in some cases, the most proximal outcrops, it reaches fine sand, but generally it's silt. On the left here is an example from the Saddle Peaks, the proximal location, and the right is an example from distal location of Cottonwood. And you can see there are some recognizable changes in grain size with that proximal distal trend I've been mentioning. Just to point out a couple of the features you can see, here's a pretty easy to see quartz grain. In some cases, you can pick out feldspar. Here you can see that there's some twinning on that grain, makes it easy to recognize, but generally the grain size here is too small to be able to easily recognize quartz from feldspar. So something we utilize really heavily in this research, given the fine grain size of the Sappington. Something we utilized very heavily in the Sappington was EDS, or energy and I'll be showing these throughout the presentation, so I'm just going to walk through these colors now. Okay. So purple represents silicon, orange is potassium, blue is aluminum, green is magnesium, yellow is calcium, and red is iron. So they're translating that into the mineralogy. Purple is quartz, this pinky blue grains, those are feldspars. The greens are dolomite, the yellow is calcite, and then anytime you see some bright red, that is pyrite. So moving back to talk about the framework grains, again, you can see exactly the same thing that I highlighted in the last slide, with quartz and feldspar being the primary framework grains, and seeing the proximal to distal relationships represented here with coarser grains to the south and finer grains up to the north in the more distal locations. Lastly, I briefly mentioned it in the cross section, but there's a carbonate buildup facies that is the base of the middle member. It's present across all the way across the range and across the Sappington as a whole. And that contains some abundant carbonate allocaps. And those are largely in the form of oncoids, which are shown here by this O. And there's also a number of other carbonate fragments, whether they're brachypod spines, bivalves, and crinoid fragments. Just looking at this in thin section, you can see an oncoid, or a larger oncoid here, but it's surrounded by a silty matrix that contains both quartz and feldspar, just like the framework grains we saw. Lastly, looking at this EDS, you can see that these carbonate grains, which are again are largely calcite, which again is highlighted by these yellow areas here, are still easily recognizable. They have not been completely overprinted by diagenesis. You can still recognize these things in both thin section and in EDS. Okay, so with all that in mind, let's move on to the diagenetic sequence, and the cements are really the bulk of this what this study represents. And so the left here is just a generalized middle member diagenetic chart of the middle member. We're not going to focus on the upper and lower member today, just time constraints. But the earliest event that we observed there is feldspar dissolution. And related to that are the formation of secondary quartz overgrowths and cements, as well as illite coatings on almost framework grains. And these three are really pretty relatively minor phases, occupying between 5 and 10% of the bulk rock volume. Following that is a series of carbonate cements that are much more prevalent, being dolomite calcite. And we've broken dolomite into two types: type 1 cores, which were relatively early, followed by type 1 dolomite rims and type 2 dolomite. And those are all cross-cut by calcite and pyrite. I'm not going to get into a lot of discussion about porosity creation today, again, due to time constraints, but the largest amount of porosity creation that we observed is related to that early feldspar dissolution, with much more minor stages later on in the diagenetic history associated with dissolution of some of those carbonate cements. So just to give you a preview of what we're going to go through and give you an idea of what these things look like in thin section and EDS. To the top right here is an EDS view of one of these euhedral zone dolomite crystals, overprinted a quartz grain here. And then similarly in thin section at the bottom, you see exactly the same thing with a dolomite core, labeled D1 here, and a easy to recognize core or rim around that core, which is obviously a later phase on that earlier form. Okay, so starting off with quartz and clay, and again, these are relatively minor phases compared to the carbonate cements we'll talk about next. But on the left here is a diagram, it's a photomicrograph, of a tetrahedral quartz grain, where you can see a really easy to recognize syntaxal quartz overgrowth highlighted by this black arrow. And also I'll point out the proximity to a dissolved feldspar grain, you can see on the bottom of the photomicrograph here. And also the abundance of this brown material, which is illite lining on these pores. In some cases, although it's quite rare, some of these overgrowths can coalesce together and form this patchy quartz cement, shown over here on the right, which completely occludes porosity and results in very little carbonate cement being precipitated in these particular intervals that have a high abundance of quartz cement. So moving on to dolomite, and again, these are the phases that comprise a majority of the rock volume. And to remind you, we've broken dolomite into two phases. The first looking at here are these euhedral zone dolomites. In the EDS, the darker color here represents a higher abundance of magnesium. And these progressively lighter phases represent an increase in calcium and iron as you move away from the center of these crystals. In most cases, these rims or these dolomite cores, type 1 dolomite cores, are found precipitating on detrital feldspar grains or remnants of detrital feldspar grains. Again, suggesting these are a later stage than that feldspar dissolution. And in many cases, this abundance of feldspar within the dolomite crystal itself results in that cloudy appearance of the cores in thin section that I showed on the last slide. So it makes it kind of easy to recognize the cores from the rims in thin section. Last point I want to make before moving on is that something that we commonly observe is that these rims get progressively lighter or progressively get higher in calcium and iron the further away you get, or the closer you get to the rim of the crystal, suggesting that that's recognizing a change in fluid composition through time as these crystals grow. And just to give you an idea of what this looks like in thin sections, since most of us look at thin sections on EDS all the time, here again you can see that the cloudy nature of this dolomite core with a much clearer rim, making these pretty easy to recognize in thin section. And then it's the view of when the crystal is a little bit bigger and zoomed in a little bit further. You can see the cloudy nature of the core relative to the rims that we saw in the EDS. So looking now at type 2 dolomite. So these are also present as these subhedral ROMs and really are easiest to recognize, yes, due to the elemental differences between these and type 1 dolomites. And these are a ROM that does not have that core. So these are not zoned to the same extent that the type 1 dolomites are. So they don't have that magnesium-rich core that the type 1 dolomites are typified by. Something else that's interesting about this phase is both the type 2 dolomites and the type 1 rims are commonly found replacing detrital feldspar. So you can see this arrow here when this crystal is growing into this detrital feldspar grain up in the top right view of this EDS map. And looking to the EDS map here on the left, just give you a better, or zooming out to kind of give you a better view of how this all fits together relative with one phase relative to another. You can see that the type 1 dolomites are typically the most abundant, but you can see a number of these areas that have the type 2 crystals only and not the type 1. But again, these are the phases that comprise a majority of the rock volume, typically between 50 and 61%. So the last phase we're going to talk about is calcite, and this also exists as two phases, or as two types. So the first over here on the left is a phase that fills in the porosity around those earlier formed dolomites. And the second is a replacive phase, which completely replaces dolomite, and in some cases feldspar. So up here where this yellow, or where this white arrow is, you can see there's some of these remnant areas of green representing that calcite was replaced, or dolomite was replaced by calcite, and there's still a remnant of that previous dolomite still here. Then down here to the left with the black arrow, you can see the calcite cement is obviously replacing this detrital feldspar grain with a couple of these little remnants of feldspar being present still in the calcite. So again, the type 1 is a pore filling phase, type 2 is a replacive phase. So looking now at the chemistry of these cements, of just the carbonate cements. So on the left is a ternary diagram between magnesium, iron, and calcium. The different colors here representing the different types of carbonate cements. So in green, we have the type 1 cores. In blue are the type 1 rims. In purple are those type 2 dolomites. And then to the right, we have the type 1 or the pore filling phase of calcite in yellow, and then the type 2 or the replacive phase in red. And so you'll see that the type 1 cores plot nicely here at about the stoichiometric line for dolomite, so 50% magnesium, 50% calcium. And then as we move into those rims and to the type 2 dolomites, we see an increase in calcium and iron relative to the core, which is exactly what I mentioned in the EDS maps. And then looking at the calcite cements, the pore filling phase typically has a lot of iron and magnesium associated with it. And the replacive phase commonly plots almost 100% calcium, in the exceptions of where it's replacing dolomite in these two instances. And then to the right are the same ternary diagram, but now looking at each phase in particular of just the dolomite cements. These are colored, it might be kind of hard to see on the screen, actually, it's okay. Are colored from proximal to distal. So the more distal outcrops are darker, and the more proximal outcrops are lighter. So looking first here at the type 1 dolomite, or the cores of type 1 dolomites, everything basically plots at stoichiometric, that which is I'm blanking on the word right now, suggesting, wow, that there's a similar fluid source for all of the dolomites across the range, type 1 dolomite cores across the range. Looking now to the rims and the cores, you see a much different story. So these light colors all seem to plot near the bottom of the iron line, suggesting they don't have a lot of iron within the crystal structure. As we move to the more distal locations, we see progressively more iron as we get into those distal locations. And again, if you remember from earlier, that's where we have thicker, more organic rich units that have also have higher clay contents. And lastly, we see a similar thing with the type 2 dolomite ROMs as well, where we see the proximal outcrops have the lowest abundance of iron, and they become progressively more iron rich as we move to the more distal parts of the basin. Okay, so moving on now to talk about some of the controls on the distribution of these cements across the range. Starting off with looking at the relationship to facies associations. So here, just a number of box and whisker plots for both dolomite and calcite, dolomite in green, calcite in yellow. They're broken out by the individual facies associations. With the exception of middle and upper short face, those are lumped together due to the lack of upper short face deposits across the range. There's only a couple of samples we have there. So starting off with the offshore deposits, we see relatively low amounts of both dolomite and calcite. Moving to the carbonate buildup, we see a pretty wide range of both dolomite and calcite cements. However, this interval, or these facies, have the highest average of calcite cement, or of calcite content, I should say, and that's due to the fact there's a lot of detrital allochems that are present in that interval that can explain why the calcite is so much higher than interval relative to. So they're not diagenetic, they're more Lastly, looking at the offshore transition in the middle of the upper shoreface deposits, we see generally the same average dolomite and calcite abundances. However, the middle of the upper shoreface does have a little bit more variability in its dolomite contents, but not all that convincing. So we don't really see a control at the facies level to the diagenic alteration. Looking at the stratigraphic architecture and the relationship to those deep-seated faults, the deep-seated fault that I mentioned earlier yields a different story. So these are the same cross-section that I showed earlier from Anna, but now I've taken the facies off, and I'm only looking at the cliniform boundaries and the major stratigraphic surfaces from that cross-section. So the cliniform boundaries are the dotted lines, and the major stratigraphic surfaces are these solid lines. Then plotted next to the outcrop is the XRD, weight percent XRD, weight percent dolomite from XRD, wow, for each one of these outcrop locations. So you can see how that varies next to these stratigraphic surfaces. And then the red line here is that past fault that I alluded to. And the bottom is exactly the same data, but it is linearly interpolated in MATLAB from outcrop to outcrop. And these surfaces, these cliniform boundaries or stratigraphic surfaces, were not used as bounding surfaces. So it's just strictly interpolating one point to another across the range. And so I want to bring back a couple of the points I mentioned earlier to discuss how the diagenic alteration relates to those. So the first was that the lower shale thickened significantly from south to north. As it does, the total amount of TOC increases. And we see the highest abundance of dolomite in those locations where the lower and middle shales are thickest and most clay rich. Second was the relationship to that pass range fault that I talked about earlier, or the pass fault that I mentioned earlier. And it seems to be there's a local abundance of dolomite on the down-thrown side of that fault, where we saw the thickening in the upper shale, which again suggests that it's been active throughout a majority of the depositional history. And on the up-thrown side, we don't see the same thing. So there's obviously something different going on between the up-thrown and down-thrown sides of that fault. And lastly is the relationship to these cliniform boundaries that I alluded to. So you can see generally on looking from laterally from one outcrop to the next, you can kind of convince yourself there's some correlation to cliniform boundaries, but it becomes much more convincing when looking at one outcrop in isolation. So we take a look at the North Cottonwood outcrop, where we have the densest sampling vertically through this upper siltstone to see how the dolomite or the diagenic alterations coincide with these cliniform boundaries. So again, we're zooming in just the top portion of the North Cottonwood outcrop here. Each one of these tracks represents the individual weight percent XRD for each particular mineral. Dashed lines are the cliniforms from top to base, so 1 through 7. And then on the right here is an EDS example from each one of those cliniforms. So going from top to bottom, A through F. So what I want you to notice is that in these bottom 3 cliniforms, we kind of see the same morphology and abundance of dolomite and calcite from top to bottom. There's a little bit more calcite toward the top, but generally the things look the same, both from an abundance standpoint and from a morphology standpoint. As we move up to these cliniforms 5 and 6, things start to change pretty drastically. Particularly looking at this EDS view B, there's no dolomite in these samples whatsoever, or very little. And there's this well-preserved molded porosity after feldspar that we don't really see anywhere else in the section, and it's kind of limited to this cliniform. So this might suggest that this cliniform itself had a pretty unique fluid flow history relative to the things that are around. And lastly, getting to the top of the upper siltstone here, this is where the proximity to the upper shale seems to have some control on the morphology of calcite. So I should say upper and lower shale seems to have some type of control on the morphology of calcite, where this type 1 replacive phase is really limited to this uppermost portion of the upper siltstone, and is obviously had some type of different deposition or diagenetic history than things. So it seems that these cliniforms may have imparted some differences in diagenesis, as they might have restricted fluid flow from one cliniform to another. Okay, so now I'm going to walk you through a conceptual model for how all this fits together. And so I'm going to walk you through the figure over here on the right, as I'll be showing this for a couple of slides. So the colors we're looking at represent differences in facies association. So the gray is offshore. The purple here is that carbonate buildup that I mentioned. Yellow is middle shore face, orange upper shore face, and then lastly, the brown is offshore transition. We're looking from proximal on the right and the south to distal on the left. So this is the first time step. This is shortly after or during deposition of the middle member. As I mentioned previously, there was a 2 to 3 million year hiatus at the top of the middle member, which resulted in meteoric influx into the Sappington, which resulted in the dissolution of feldspar and provided some ions for coursing and Clayton precipitation. So that's represented on the figure here by these dashed blue lines, which represent areas that had feldspar dissolution. And then the cements will be in these kind of cross hair, or these crosses in red. So we think that as feldspar dissolved, some of that was transported out of the system in a more of an open diagenetic scenario as a result of all the high amount of fluid flux that was being experienced as the meteoric water kept infiltrating through time. And this is, I should say, this is relatively limited to the upper portion of the Sappington. We don't really observe this nearly as prevalently in the bottom portion of the Sappington. And it seems that some of the facies transitions along the cladoform might have imparted some changes in fluid flow as well, where the coarser grained, higher permeability facies in the upper shore face probably had higher fluid flux than what we saw further down in the toes of the cladoforms in the offshore transition faces. So kind of relating this back to what I talked about earlier, there's kind of two different pathways we could have taken here, depending on whether we were an open or closed system, and that probably has some relationship to facies as fluid would have moved more easily through those higher energy, higher permeability sediments at the top versus those at the bottom. So it could have gone from potassium feldspar to kaolinite and quartz, or just went straight to an aqueous phase from potassium feldspar and then transported away from the solution. So this meteoric influx was then followed by a large transgression during the deposition of the upper shale. So you probably have a transgressive Revema surface at the top of the middle member. That would have resulted in a change in the pore fluid, something that's more akin to marine, to seawater as a result of that transgression. And from that, we think that was the source for the initial type 1 dolomite cores to form. So we see we think that probably provided the source for both magnesium, calcium, and carbonate ions to begin to form from that modified sediment. And again, as I mentioned previously, we don't really see any changes in the cement chemistry from north to south. So we don't think there's a large change in the pore fluid chemistry from north to south either, which we can explain with it all being derived from cement. The next phase was shallow burial. So this is generally that time frame that I mentioned earlier. So after the Mississippian, we had that long period of tectonic quiescence where the Sappington was about 70 degrees Celsius and stayed that way for about 100 million years. So during this time, the mechanical compaction would have driven the remaining conite water from the shales, and eventually the siltstones themselves would begin to compact. And from that, the type 1 dolomite cores continued to precipitate from that conite water. So from a fluid flow perspective, this would have been really sluggish compared to what we have observed in the meteoric influx event. But generally, the fluid flow would have wanted to go up and out towards the edge of the basin. But again, that would have been really sluggish and not necessarily a huge fluid flow. But again, this is where the type 1 dolomite cores continue to form. And it wasn't until deep burial, so about greater than 2 kilometers near max burial of the Sappington, that things started to get interesting, and that we observed a lot of these diagenetic phases beginning to form. So during this time, again, we're about 100 degrees C. The shale members undergo the smectite to illite transition, which release interlayer clays and associated cations. So this equation here kind of shows what that looks like, but it all depends on the initial smectite, or the composition of the initial smectite, which of course we don't know. But generally, this reaction releases a lot of calcium, iron, and magnesium, aka the ions that would be present in those ferro and dolomite rims that I mentioned. At the same time this is happening, the organic rich and upper and lower shales are undergoing the thermal decarboxylation of organic matter, which increases the partial pressure of CO2 within the Sappington. And that would have promoted carbonate precipitation. So during this time, type 1 dolomite rims and the type 2 dolomite ROMs precipitate, and in a lot of cases, they're dissolving feldspar due to that increase in CO2. So if we can derive this directly, if we can derive those minerals directly from the ions that are released from the shales to precipitate ferro and dolomite shown here. then lastly is those cations depleted. So as we use more of that magnesium and more of that iron to precipitate more and more ferro and dolomite, eventually calcite became a stable phase and filled in the pores outside of the dolomites, or in some cases, as we're closer to that organic, upper and lower organic rich shales, calcite formed at the expense of dolomite, whether that's due to an increase in the partial pressure of CO2 there, making calcite a stable phase, or there was just a lot more calcium there for whatever reason, I'm not sure. But we definitely see an enrichment of that phase at the contact of the upper and lower shales. So again, just to kind of summarize this last part of the conceptual model, I think a lot of the ions that were used to precipitate the ferro and dolomite were derived internally from the upper, middle, and lower shale members, as well as from the thermal decarboxylation of. Some of you are probably thinking, well, couldn't use isotopes to tell you where the carbon is coming from, and unfortunately, we don't have those. But there is a lot of similarities between what is observed in Sappington and what's observed in the Bakken. So this is a paper that was published recently in the Bakken, and this is a BSE image, so backscatter electron, but it tells us something very similar to the ES maps. And they see very similar morphologies of dolomite in the Bakken as we do in the Sappington. So just like I mentioned earlier, showed you in the Sappington earlier, there is a magnesium-rich core here in this dark color, surrounded by a number of varying degrees of iron-rich rims. So in this case, they've got 2 and 3 different rims identified in the Bakken. And so what we're looking at along this transect are carbon and oxygen isotope measurements. This is using a technique called SIMS, where you can get about a 2 micron wide sample of a carbon or oxygen isotope, which is kind of cool. And so what you're seeing along the length of this transect from the core out to the rims, looking particularly at this kind of teal color, dark teal color, in the rims, the carbon isotope or the delta 13 is about 0, so something that is kind of similar to seawater. And as you move further away from that core into the rims, you see more and more, or you see a more depleted delta 13 of carbon, suggesting more organic influence. So again, that would fit the story that we just talked about, with a lot of the carbon and other ions coming from the shales due to either the spectator-like transition or from the thermal decarboxylation of the organic matters. So I think that's shown really well over here on this diagram to the right. So the top one in particular, looking at a cross plot between delta 13 of carbon and delta 18 oxygen. And then now these are colored by the iron content of the individual signal. And so the darker colors here are lower iron content, and the lighter colors are higher iron content. So the most iron-rich samples have the lowest or the most depleted delta 13 of carbon, suggesting there's more organic influence where we have more iron in the carbonates, which is exactly what we were proposing for the Sappington, with those later stages being derived from the shales. So just to kind of wrap this up, there's some implications for reservoir quality in the Bakken. As I just mentioned, there's very similar diagenetic history between the Sappington and Bakken formations. So looking down here at the bottom, there's a view of the same BSE view of the Sappington dolomite versus a Bakken dolomite. You can see the same looking core followed by a series of progressively more iron-rich rims. So using the relationships between cement distribution, stratigraphic architecture, and those major structural features can have direct relevance to the Bakken formation and understanding the reservoir quality there. And so looking at this map to the right, which is an oil-water ratio for the first 90 days of production of Bakken, we're not going to be predicting the first order basin-centered accumulation here, but maybe applying this type of understanding or thinking about the reservoir quality in the Bakken from this perspective on the edges of the play might help be more predictive about how far we can push that economic boundary. And lastly, the model that I've proposed here can be applied to other tight hybrid plays, as these organic, non-organic interactions are surely to occur in other basins and other parts of the world. With that, to wrap up some conclusions quickly. So there's 6 cement types recognized in the Sappington, with the carbonate cements being the most pervasive and include porosity. The fluids and ions responsible for carbonate cementation were largely internally derived. The thickness, clay content, and organic richness within the individual shale members is the primary control of mineralization. But also there's some stratigraphic architecture in that upper siltstone in particular that play a role in cement distribution. The major structural features, aka the pass fault, locally concentrated cement. And lastly, that the facies display little correlation. And then, of course, as I just mentioned, the diagenetic model can be applied to the Bakken. So with that, I'll leave you some beautiful field photos of the Bridger Range. On the right, the favorite here is on the left. We can see the cross range thrust that I mentioned previously, places Mississippian rocks on top of facies rocks, and then that's all been upturned due to those later structural events that I mentioned. And if you want more details, this work has been published in 2 papers, one in the Mountain Geologist and one in the Petroleum Geology in 2021. Or you can shoot myself or Michael Hoppe an email if you have any questions. So with that, we'll take some questions. And yeah, thank you.
So I work in the environmental geology space and do a lot of field investigations with energy dispersive XRF. I can't know that nursing and such. And I'm totally ignorant to what this technology is that we use on these sections to get all the way down, not just elemental analysis, but mineral identifications. Could you describe what it is? Are there like commercially available instruments that you can buy from the lab? Do they automatically give you their software like mineral analysis? Is that something you've got to do post process or whatever? Can you describe the technology?
Sure. I'm going to repeat the question for people. So the question, I'm talking to this, right, Mark? Sorry. Okay, I'm gonna. What?
Everywhere, I don't know.
Okay. I'm hoping that everyone online can hear the question better. So the question was regarding those EDS maps. How do you get from that to something that you can identify mineralogy with? Is that kind of summarizing it well?
Yeah, okay. Yeah. What is the technology?
Sure.
Is it XRF at a micro scale or?
So it's energy dispersive spectroscopy. So it's using an SEM machine that has an actual device attached to the SEM machine. So it takes that elemental information and then overlays it with a backscattered electron image to get the views that we're looking at there. And it's using actual mineralogy. I haven't actually done that, so I'm not sure. I'm making inferences based on what I know about the rocks from XRD, which does give you a mineral analysis, and then suggesting based on the elements I see in EDS, it should be that. I'm sure there's a way you can do it, but I mean, I might be.
And then how do you take it to images that you've got that are color-coded mineralogical images? Is that a post-processing phase as well? It's not an optical image. How do you get to these mineral images?
So the way it works is that it actually it shoots those electrons at the mineral, right? That bounces off and it tells you what that element should be. Does that at every little spot on the thin section, and then so that gives you whatever the resolution of it is. I'm not sure off the top of my head. It'll give you that analysis at every single point, and then we use that backscattered electron image to overlay with this to give you something that looks much more geologic interpretable. Otherwise, it's like just a bunch of dots everywhere. You can't really interpret. So that the merging of the two really gives you the context you can use to make these types of predictions. Yeah.
Did you think you use a cathode luminescence to
Tried, and there was no difference. We were quite surprised by that. So I'm sorry, the question was, did we use cathodoluminescence to try to identify the cement stratigraphy? And we tried, but we didn't see any differences from the cores to the rims. Ron, do you get a question?
Yeah, your sediments are pretty fine grained. What was the driver that caused the weaker water to invade? And do you have an idea about how deep the fine fell?
So the question was, these are pretty fine grained, probably pretty low permeability sediments. What was the drive for the meteoric water to be moved down into the Sappington, and how deep did it go? Yeah, I think that the silt size grains of the sediment probably made it pretty difficult for any mass, groundwater flow to occur through these sediments. And that's probably why we don't see a complete dissolution of feldspar. It's pretty partial. And that probably, I didn't mention it a lot because I didn't want to get into details, but probably occurred throughout the entire diagenetic history, given that we see all those carbonate cements. The feldspars are probably really unstable for a really long time. So I think it happened, but it wasn't as pervasive as it would have been had the big ocean.
Was the seawater a unique chemistry that it was helping to precipitate dolomite? Because in the younger rocks that I'm familiar with, we really don't see that.
So I think there's two hypotheses for that question. And I'm not, the answer is I'm not sure exactly. But one of them being that the organic rich shales that are interbedded with these, and that undergoing methanogenesis or whatever it's called, might have made, had some earlier releases of CO2 that promoted dolomite precipitation within these rocks. The second is that it stayed at that temperature of 70 degrees C for a really long time. 200 million years is a long time to have contact water in the system. So to me, that's probably the most reasonable explanation. Is that's just a really long time to be sitting at a kilometer of air at that temperature. So you can get to equilibrium in the system, and the minerals can be happy.
Nice talk.
Thank you.
The online questions? Bridget? Nothing.
Okay. Well, thank you for your time.
Yeah, we want to thank Clayton. He is by far one of the smartest people in Golden, best dressed, and the third nicest. I will say that. And we actually have a gift for you here. It's obviously not from Sappington. There's some reach builders in there, but there you go.
Where is it from?
We'll talk later. Talk to Ron. And I just want to say, I gave him a challenge at the beginning, and oil did go up about 75 cents while we were here. But don't get too excited because your stock price went down about 0.4. So there you go. Be sure to register early for next month's talk. It's going to be a really good one. And tell your friends, please. Let's fill this place up like it was pre-2020. So thank you. Thanks for coming.